The biting wind cut through the mountain pass like a knife. But it wasn't the cold that made Josephine Hayes tighten her grip on the reins. It was the low, distant rumble that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her wagon wheels. She glanced up at the snow-laden peaks, towering above the narrow trail, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air of Colorado's San Juan Mountains. Winter had come early in 1876, and she was running dangerously late. "Just a bit further, boys," she urged her team of horses, who trudged forward with visible reluctance through the fresh snowfall. "We'll make it to Durango before nightfall." The journey from Denver had already taken far longer than she'd anticipated. At 25, Josephine had thought herself prepared for the challenges of traveling west to claim the property her late uncle had left her, a small ranch just outside Durango that represented her only chance at a fresh start. What remained of her family back east had made it clear that a woman with her reputation divorced and childless was better off elsewhere. The rumbling grew louder, drowning out the creak of wagon wheels and the snort of her horses. Josephine felt a flutter of panic in her chest as she squinted up at the mountainside. A wall of white was descending, gathering momentum as it came. "Dear God," she whispered, snapping the reins hard. "Go, go!" The horses surged forward in terror, but the path was narrow and treacherous. The roar became deafening, and Josephine barely had time to throw herself down in the wagon bed before the world exploded into blinding white. The force of the avalanche struck the wagon like a massive fist, sending it careening into the mountainside. She felt the sickening lurch as the wagon tipped, heard the terrified screams of her horses cut brutally short. Then came the crushing weight of snow, pressing in from all sides, and darkness swallowed her whole. Miles away, Preston Hawkins pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse along the mountain trail. At 30 years old, he'd spent most of his adult life in these mountains, working as a scout and occasionally as a guide for travelers making their way through the treacherous passes. Today, he was returning to Durango after delivering supplies to a mining camp further north. The first sign of trouble was the fresh scar on the mountainside. Preston reined in his horse, studying the massive displacement of snow with a practiced eye. Avalanches weren't uncommon in these parts, especially after the heavy snowfall they'd had in recent days, but the sight always filled him with dread. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured to his nervous horse. "Let's take a closer look." As he approached, Preston noticed something protruding from the vast field of displaced snow, the splintered remains of what looked like a wagon wheel. His heart sank. Someone had been caught in the slide. Without hesitation, he dismounted, secured his horse to a sturdy pine, and trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the wreckage. Years in the mountains had taught him that the chances of finding survivors after an avalanche were slim at best, but he couldn't ride away without checking. "Hello." He called out, his voice seeming small against the vast silence of the mountains. "Anyone alive in there?" The only response was the whisper of wind through the pines. Preston pulled off his gloves and dug into the saddlebag for the small, folding shovel he carried for emergencies. Looking at the massive pile of snow, he knew he should ride for help, but something told him time was of the essence. He began to dig where he'd seen the wagon wheel, working methodically despite the biting cold. After uncovering more of the wagon's frame, he realized it had been thrown against the mountainside and partially crushed. If anyone had been inside, they'd be trapped in a pocket beneath tons of snow and splintered wood. "Hello," he called again, pausing to listen. This time, he thought he heard something, a faint tapping from beneath the snow. With renewed vigor, Preston attacked the snow, digging frantically. His hands grew numb despite his efforts to keep them warm, and his muscles burned with exertion, but he refused to stop. Someone was alive under there, and every minute counted. After nearly an hour of digging, he uncovered what remained of the wagon's canvas cover. Using his knife, he cut through the heavy material, revealing a small pocket of space within. And there, huddled in the corner, was a woman pale as the snow around her but unmistakably alive. "Madam," Preston reached in cautiously. "Can you hear me?" Josephine's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening in surprise and relief. "You found me," she whispered, her voice weak from cold and fear. "I'm going to get you out of there," Preston promised, carefully clearing away more snow and debris. "Are you hurt?" Josephine tried to move and winced. "My leg, I think it might be broken, and I can't feel my hands." Preston nodded grimly. Frostbite was a serious concern, and a broken leg would make getting her off the mountain much more difficult, but at least she was alive. "My name's Preston Hawkins," he said as he worked, wanting to keep her conscious and talking. "I scout these mountains." "What's your name, madam?" "Josephine Hayes," she managed through chattering teeth. "I was heading to Durango." "Well, Miss Hayes, we're still going to get you there," Preston said with more confidence than he felt. "I just need to dig a bit more so I can pull you out without hurting you further." It took another hour of careful excavation before Preston could safely extract Josephine from the wreckage. By then, the sun was starting its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. Night in the high country would be deadly for someone in Josephine's condition. With gentle hands, Preston lifted her from the ruins of her wagon. She was lighter than he expected, her slender frame seeming almost fragile in his arms. He carried her to his horse, where he'd prepared a makeshift nest of blankets. "My horses," Josephine said suddenly, looking back at the Avalanche site. "And my things." Preston shook his head solemnly. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes, your team didn't make it. As for your belongings, they'll have to wait. Right now, we need to get you somewhere warm." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes, but she nodded in understanding. Preston helped her into the saddle before mounting behind her, supporting her weight against his chest. With one arm securely around her waist, he guided Thunder carefully down the trail. "There's a line shack about 2 miles from here," he explained. "It's not much, but it's got a stove and 4 walls. We'll get you warmed up and I'll take a look at that leg." Josephine nodded weakly, too exhausted and in too much pain to speak. The warmth of Preston's body behind her was the only thing keeping her from slipping back into darkness. She focused on staying conscious, on the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, and the secure strength of the arm around her waist. By the time they reached the line shack, twilight had deepened into dusk. Preston dismounted quickly and carried Josephine inside, setting her gently on the small cot while he hurried to light the stove and a lantern. The shack was indeed modest, just a single room with a cot, a small table, 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove. But to Josephine, it looked like salvation. As warmth gradually filled the space, she felt sensation painfully returning to her extremities. Preston moved with practiced efficiency, gathering wood from the stack by the stove, filling a pot with snow to melt for water, and retrieving supplies from his saddlebags. When the basic necessities were attended to, he returned to Josephine's side. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes before you can warm up properly," he said, his tone matter-of-fact but his eyes respectfully averted. "Can you manage on your own, or do you need help?" Josephine's cheeks flushed despite her pallor. "I'll need some help, I'm afraid. But perhaps you could turn around while I do what I can." Preston nodded, providing her with one of his spare shirts and a blanket before turning his back. Josephine struggled painfully out of her sodden dress and undergarments, wincing as the movement jarred her injured leg. By the time she had pulled Preston's shirt over her head and wrapped the blanket around her lower half, she was exhausted and trembling with pain. "You can turn around now," she said softly. "And thank you, Mr. Hawkins. You saved my life today." Preston turned, his expression softening as he took in her pale face and the obvious pain in her eyes. "Let's take a look at that leg," he said, kneeling beside the cot. Careful to maintain her modesty, Preston examined her leg, his touch gentle but confident. "It's broken, all right," he confirmed grimly. "I need to set it before we can splint it. It's going to hurt something fierce." Josephine nodded, her jaw tight. "Do what you must." Preston hesitated, then retrieved a flask from his coat pocket. "Whiskey," he explained. "Not much, but it might take the edge off." Josephine accepted the flask with a small, grateful nod and took a long swallow, gasping as the liquor burned its way down her throat. Preston waited a moment for it to take effect, then positioned his hands on her leg. "Ready?" he asked, his blue eyes holding hers steadily. Josephine nodded, then bit down hard on the edge of the blanket as Preston set the bone with a quick, practiced movement. A scream tore from her throat despite her best efforts to remain stoic, and tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry," Preston said softly, already reaching for the strips of wood and cloth he'd prepared for a splint. "Worst part's over now." As he worked to secure the splint, Josephine studied him through a haze of pain. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His sandy brown hair fell in waves to his collar, and a short beard covered his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her attention, a clear, steady blue that somehow managed to convey both strength and kindness. "How long have you been up in these mountains?" she asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from the pain. Preston's hands continued their work as he answered. "Going on 10 years now. Came west after the war looking for something different. Found I had a knack for finding my way around these parts. Been working as a scout and guide ever since." "The war?" Josephine asked. "You fought?" A shadow crossed Preston's face. "Union cavalry, but that's a lifetime ago now." Josephine nodded, sensing the reluctance in his tone. "And do you have family in Durango?" Preston shook his head, finishing the splint and sitting back to examine his handiwork. "No family to speak of. My parents passed before the war and my brother didn't make it back." He cleared his throat, changing the subject. "What about you, Miss Hayes? What brings a lady like yourself to these parts alone?" Josephine hesitated, wondering how much to share with this stranger who'd saved her life. "My uncle left me a small ranch outside Durango. I'm a widow with no children and few prospects back east, so I decided to make a fresh start." It wasn't entirely true she was divorced. Not widowed, but experience had taught her that people were more sympathetic to a widow than a divorced woman. And right now, she needed all the sympathy she could get. Preston nodded, accepting her story without question. "Well, you've had a rough start, but Durango's a good town. Once we get you there, you'll find folks willing to help you get settled." "And when will that be?" Josephine asked, looking toward the small window where snow had begun to fall again. Preston followed her gaze, his expression grim. "Not tomorrow, I'm afraid. That leg needs rest, and from the sound of it, another storm's moving in. We'll have to wait it out here." Josephine's heart sank. She'd planned her journey with limited funds, and every day of delay meant resources she couldn't afford to lose. More than that, the thought of being stranded in this tiny cabin with a man she barely knew, regardless of how honorable he seemed, was unsettling. Preston seemed to read her thoughts. "I know it's not ideal, Miss Hayes, but I promise you'll be safe with me. I'll take the floor, and once the weather clears, I'll get you to town as quickly as possible." Josephine studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or ill intent, but found only sincerity. She nodded slowly. "I don't have much choice, do I? And please call me Josephine. After pulling me from an avalanche and setting my broken leg, I think we can dispense with formalities." A small smile tugged at the corner of Preston's mouth. "Josephine, then, and I'm Preston to my friends. Are we friends, Mr. Hawkins?" Josephine asked, a hint of her own smile emerging despite the pain and exhaustion. "I reckon we're at least friendly acquaintances," Preston replied, rising to his feet. "And now this friendly acquaintance is going to make you some coffee and something to eat. You need to keep up your strength." As Preston busied himself with the stove, Josephine settled back against the thin pillow, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. Everything she owned had been in that wagon: clothes, supplies, her meager savings, and the deed to her uncle's property. Without those things, what would become of her? The storm that had threatened arrived in full force during the night, howling around the small shack like a living thing. Josephine drifted in and out of fitful sleep, her leg throbbing and her mind churning with worries. Each time she woke, she found Preston still awake, either feeding the stove or sitting at the small table, keeping watch. "Don't you sleep?" she asked during one such awakening, her voice thick with exhaustion. Preston looked up from cleaning his revolver by the light of the single lantern. "I'll get some rest soon, just making sure the fire stays hot. How's the pain?" "Manageable," Josephine lied, not wanting to trouble him further. "You should rest too. I won't think less of you for sleeping." A half smile crossed his face. "I appreciate that. I'll turn in soon, I promise." True to his word, Preston eventually spread his bedroll on the floor near the stove and stretched out. Though Josephine noticed, he positioned himself between her and the door, a protective gesture that both reassured and intrigued her. Morning brought no respite from the storm. If anything, it had intensified overnight. Preston rose early and rekindled the fire, then checked on Josephine's leg. The splint was holding well, but her ankle had swollen alarmingly, and dark bruises mottled her pale skin. "We need to keep it elevated," he said, arranging her blankets and using his folded coat as a cushion under her leg. "And cold compresses might help with the swelling." Josephine watched as he packed snow into a square of cloth and gently applied it to her ankle. "You seem to know quite a bit about treating injuries," she observed. Preston shrugged. "You learn what you need to up here. Doctors are few and far between." As the day wore on, they settled into an unexpected companionship. Preston told stories of his years in the mountains, encounters with grizzlies, the time he got lost in a blizzard and survived by digging a snow cave, the characters he'd met in mining camps and frontier towns. Josephine, in turn, shared carefully edited versions of her life back east, her childhood in Philadelphia, her love of books, her dreams of someday having a place to truly call her own. By unspoken mutual agreement, they both skirted around the more painful parts of their pasts. Preston didn't speak of the war beyond acknowledging he'd fought, and Josephine offered no details about her failed marriage to a man who'd proven to be both cruel and unfaithful. On the second night, as the storm showed its first signs of abating, Preston surprised Josephine by producing a battered deck of cards from his saddlebag. "Thought you might be getting bored with just my conversation for entertainment," he said, shuffling the deck with practiced hands. Josephine smiled, genuinely pleased by the thoughtful gesture. "What shall we play?" "Lady's choice," Preston replied, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "You know how to play whist?" Preston nodded, dealing the cards. "My mother taught me when I was a boy. Said it was important for a gentleman to know card games that weren't just for gambling. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Preston said simply, and Josephine heard the echo of old grief in those two words. They played until Josephine's eyelids grew heavy, and even then, she was reluctant to end the evening. There was something soothing about Preston's presence, a steadiness that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't experienced in years. By morning, The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine snow and ice-draped trees that sparkled in the sunlight. Preston opened the door to check conditions and let in a blast of frigid air that made Josephine pull her blankets tighter. "Trail's going to be treacherous," he said, looking out at the deep snow. "But if we wait for it to melt, we could be here another week. Your leg needs proper medical attention sooner than that. What do you suggest?" Josephine asked, trying to ignore the way her stomach knotted at the thought of leaving their small sanctuary. Preston considered for a moment. "I can fashion a travois for Thunder to pull. It won't be comfortable, but it'll get you to town without you having to ride astride with that leg." Josephine nodded, trusting his judgment. "How long will it take? If we leave by midday and the trail's passable, we should reach Durango by tomorrow evening." Preston hesitated, then added, "I'll need to gather some supplies before we go. Think you'll be all right here alone for an hour or so?" "Of course," Josephine assured him, though the thought of being alone made her more uneasy than she cared to admit. While Preston was gone, Josephine took stock of her situation. She had no clothes beyond the borrowed shirt she wore, no money, and no proof of her claim to her uncle's property. Even if she reached Durango safely, what then? Would anyone believe her story? And how would she support herself until she could establish the ranch by the time Preston returned? Dragging pine saplings for the travois, Josephine had worked herself into a state of quiet panic. She tried to hide it, but Preston was more observant than she'd given him credit for. "What's troubling you?" he asked as he set to work lashing the saplings together with rawhide strips. "Besides the obvious, I mean." Josephine hesitated, then decided honesty was her best course. "Everything I owned was in that wagon, Mr. Hawkins. My clothes, my supplies, my money. Even the deed to my uncle's property. I'm heading to Durango with nothing but the shirt on my back, your shirt, at that." Preston's hand stilled on the travois. "The deed was the only proof you had of your claim." Josephine nodded miserably. "I have no family in Durango to vouch for me, and my uncle's lawyer is back in Denver. I'm not sure anyone will believe me without documentation." Preston resumed his work, his expression thoughtful. "Well, we'll just have to recover what we can from the wagon then." Josephine stared at him. "But the avalanche buried it, yes. But come spring, that snow will melt. In the meantime, I know the county clerk in Durango. Name's Walter Simmons. Good man. If we explain the situation, he might be able to send a telegram to your uncle's lawyer to verify your claim." "You do that for me?" Josephine asked, touched by his willingness to help. Preston shrugged as if it were nothing. "Seems the least I can do. Besides, I'd like to think someone would do the same for my sister if she were in your situation." "I thought you said you had no family," Josephine said, confused. A shadow passed over Preston's face. "I said I had no family to speak of. My sister's alive, far as I know, but we haven't spoken in years. Not since I came west." There was clearly more to the story, but Josephine didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, and Preston had more than earned his privacy. By midday, the travois was ready, a simple but sturdy construction of pine poles covered with blankets and furs. Preston had fashioned a small enclosure at one end to protect Josephine from the wind and snow, complete with a makeshift roof of canvas. "It's not the Pullman car," he said with a self-deprecating smile, "but it'll get you to Durango in one piece." Moving Josephine from the cot to the travois proved to be a painful ordeal, despite Preston's gentle handling. By the time he'd settled her in the travois and secured extra blankets around her, she was pale and sweating, her teeth clenched against the pain. "We can wait another day if you need more rest," Preston offered, concerned by her pallor. Josephine shook her head firmly. "No, I want to go." The sooner we reach Durango, the sooner I can start putting my life back together." Preston nodded, respecting her determination. He secured the travois to Thunder's saddle, checked all the bindings one last time, and finally mounted up. With a gentle click of his tongue, he urged the horse forward, beginning the slow journey down the mountain. The going was slow and often treacherous. Fresh snow covered the trail, concealing icy patches and uneven ground. Preston led Thunder carefully, sometimes dismounting to guide the horse through particularly difficult stretches. Despite the discomfort of being jolted over rough terrain with a broken leg, Josephine remained stoically silent, only occasional sharp intakes of breath betraying her pain. They made camp that evening in a sheltered grove of pines. Preston built a roaring fire and constructed a simple lean-to beside it to protect Josephine from the night air. After heating a can of beans and brewing strong coffee, he helped Josephine from the travois to her makeshift bed. "How's the leg?" he asked, carefully examining the splint by firelight. "Still attached," Josephine replied with a weak smile. "Though there were moments today when I might have preferred otherwise." Preston's expression softened with sympathy. "You're tougher than you look, Josephine Hayes." Most people would be complaining a lot more about being dragged down a mountain with a broken leg. Josephine's smile turned wry. "My father always said I was too stubborn for my own good. I suppose it's finally proving useful." As they ate their simple meal, Preston found himself watching Josephine in the flickering firelight. Despite her circumstances, injured, dispossessed, far from home, there was a quiet dignity about her that he admired. And beneath the proper exterior of an Eastern lady, he'd glimpsed a spirit as resilient as any he'd encountered in the West. "May I ask you something personal?" Josephine's question broke into his thoughts. Preston nodded, curious. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "Why did you come looking in the Avalanche? Most people would have ridden on, assuming no one could have survived." The question caught Preston off guard. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "During the war, I was caught in a collapsed trench after a Confederate artillery barrage, buried alive with 3 other men from my company. 2 died before help came. The 3rd held my hand while I screamed myself hoarse calling for help." He paused, the memory still vivid after all these years. "I swore if I ever came across someone who might be trapped like that, I'd never just ride on by." Josephine's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "The man who held your hand, did he survive?" Preston nodded. "Jacob Wilkins. Last I heard, he was farming in Kansas with a wife and 4 children." A small smile touched his lips. "He writes every Christmas. Says I'm the reason he made it out, that my hollering kept him focused on something besides dying. And that's why you spend hours digging out strangers from avalanches," Josephine said softly. Preston shrugged, uncomfortable with her admiration. "It's just what anyone would do." "No," Josephine said firmly. "It isn't. And I'm grateful it was you who found me, Preston Hawkins." The way she said his name with such genuine warmth stirred something in Preston that he'd thought long dormant. He cleared his throat and rose abruptly to add more wood to the fire. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Got a long day ahead tomorrow." Josephine watched him retreat behind his customary reserve, and wondered what other stories lay behind those steady blue eyes. The night passed peacefully, and they set off at first light. The second day of travel proved even more challenging than the first as they descended into steeper terrain. By mid-afternoon, however, the trail widened and improved as they neared more frequently traveled routes. It was nearly dusk when they finally crested a ridge and saw Durango spread out in the valley below, its buildings casting long shadows in the setting sun. The sight of civilization after days in the wilderness, brought a lump to Josephine's throat. "Almost there," Preston called over his shoulder, a note of relief evident in his voice. The last mile into town seemed to take forever. As they made their way down the main street, their unusual mode of transport drew curious stares from passers-by. Preston ignored them, heading directly for a two-story building with a sign identifying it as Dr. Samuel Morgan, physician and surgeon. Preston halted thunder and quickly dismounted. "Wait here," he told Josephine. "I'll get the doctor." Minutes later, he returned with a middle-aged man carrying a black medical bag. The doctor took one look at Josephine and began issuing brisk orders. "Get her inside, Hawkins. Martha," he called to a woman who appeared in the doorway. "Prepare the examination room. We have a patient with what looks like a compound fracture." What followed was a blur of activity as Josephine was carried into the doctor's office, placed on an examination table, and subjected to a thorough examination. Dr. Morgan praised Preston's splinting job, but confirmed that the break was serious and would require weeks of immobilization. "You're lucky Mr. Hawkins found you when he did," the doctor told Josephine as he applied a more professional splint. Another day in that cold, and we might have been talking about amputation instead of healing. Josephine blanched at the thought, and Preston, who had been hovering near the door, stepped forward. "She'll need a place to stay, Doc, and some clothes. Everything she had was lost in the avalanche." Dr. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "Martha can loan you some things to start with, Miss Hayes. As for lodging—" He exchanged a look with Preston. "The hotel's expensive for a long stay." Preston hesitated only briefly. "She can stay at my place until we sort things out. I've got a spare room and I'm not there much anyway." Both the doctor and Josephine looked at him in surprise. Such an arrangement would raise eyebrows in a small town like Durango. "That's very generous, Mr. Hawkins," Josephine began cautiously, "but I wouldn't want to impose or cause talk." Preston's jaw set stubbornly. "Mrs. Fitzgerald from the Mercantile lives next door. She can chaperone if folks need reassuring. But you need a place to recover, and hotels cost money you don't have right now." Dr. Morgan cleared his throat. "It's unorthodox, but Preston's right about the practicalities, and he's one of the most honorable men I know. If he says you'll be properly looked after, I believe him." Josephine considered her limited options. She had no money, no possessions, and no proof of her identity or her claim to her uncle's property. Until she could establish herself, she needed help, and Preston had already proven himself trustworthy. "Very well," she agreed finally, "but only until I can make other arrangements." Preston nodded, relief evident in his expression. "I'll go prepare the room. Doc, can she be moved tonight or should she stay here?" "She can be moved, but carefully. I'll come by in the morning to check on her." Dr. Morgan patted Josephine's hand reassuringly. "Rest now, Miss Hayes. You've had quite an ordeal." After the doctor left, Martha, the doctor's wife and assistant, helped Josephine wash and change into a borrowed nightgown and robe. The simple act of being clean and properly clothed again nearly brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "Mr. Hawkins seems quite taken with you," Martha observed as she helped Josephine brush her long chestnut hair. "I've never seen him go to such lengths for anyone before." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "He's simply being kind to someone in need. I'm sure he'd do the same for anyone." Martha's knowing smile suggested she thought otherwise, but she didn't contradict Josephine. "Well, he's a good man, whatever his reasons. One of the few in these parts who's always treated my husband and me with respect, despite our color." Josephine hadn't noticed in the chaos of her arrival, but now she realized that Martha and Dr. Morgan were black unusual for a frontier town like Durango. "Your husband is highly regarded from what I can tell." Martha nodded. "Now, yes, But it wasn't always so. When we first arrived 5 years ago, some folks weren't keen on being treated by a colored doctor, no matter how qualified. Preston was one of the first to publicly support Sam. Said he'd trust my husband with his life after seeing him patch up wounded men during the war. The revelation added another layer to Josephine's growing understanding of Preston Hawkins, a man who judged others by their character rather than the conventions of society. It was a quality she found increasingly admirable. Preston returned as dusk deepened into night, accompanied by a robust older woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes. "Miss Hayes, this is Mrs. Alina Fitzgerald," he introduced them. "She's agreed to help get you settled and will be checking in on you regularly while you recover." Mrs. Fitzgerald surveyed Josephine with frank curiosity. "So you're the young lady Preston pulled from that Avalanche. He didn't mention how pretty you are." "Mrs. Fitzgerald," Preston protested, his ears reddening. The older woman waved off his embarrassment. "Oh, hush, I'm just stating facts. Now, let's get this girl to your house before she falls asleep sitting up." With Mrs. Fitzgerald's supervision and Preston's careful assistance, Josephine was transported to a modest but well-maintained house on the outskirts of town. To her surprise, it wasn't the rough bachelor quarters she had expected, but a proper home with simple, sturdy furniture, and even a few touches that spoke of comfort: bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes, a colorful quilt draped over the sofa, landscape paintings on the walls. "This is lovely," she said honestly as Preston carried her to the spare bedroom. "I didn't expect a real house," Preston finished with a hint of amusement. "I may spend most of my time in the mountains, but I like having a proper place to come back to." The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that would catch the morning sun. Mrs. Fitzgerald bustled about, turning down the bed covers and arranging pillows to keep Josephine's leg elevated. "I'll bring over some of my daughter's old dresses tomorrow," the older woman promised. "She's about your size and they're just gathering dust in my attic, and I'll stop by 3 times a day to help with whatever you need." She fixed Preston with a stern look. "And you, young man, will make yourself scarce when propriety demands it." Preston nodded solemnly, though Josephine caught the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, madam." After Mrs. Fitzgerald departed with promises to return early the next morning, an awkward silence fell between them. Josephine, propped up in bed with her splinted leg resting on pillows, felt suddenly shy in the presence of this man who had saved her life and now offered her shelter. "You've been extraordinarily kind, Mr. Hawkins," she said finally. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Preston leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "There's nothing to repay. Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Josephine said quietly. "You could have left me in that Avalanche. You could have deposited me at the doctor's office and considered your duty done. Instead, you've opened your home to a virtual stranger." Preston was silent for a long moment. "Maybe I just didn't like the thought of you being alone in a strange town with nothing but the clothes on your back." He straightened, as if uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "You should get some rest. I'll be in the next room if you need anything." Before Josephine could respond, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. She stared at the door for a long time, puzzling over the enigma of Preston Hawkins, a man who seemed both open and guarded, kind and distant, all at once. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Mrs. Fitzgerald arrived each morning to help Josephine bathe and dress in the borrowed clothes she had brought. Dr. Morgan visited daily to check on her leg and adjust the splint as the swelling decreased. Preston, true to his word, made himself scarce during these visits, but he was always present for meals, which he prepared with surprising skill. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Josephine asked on the third evening as they shared a remarkably good beef stew with fresh baked bread. Preston shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed by her praise. "My mother taught me the basics, said no son of hers was going to be helpless in a kitchen. The rest I picked up here and there. When you spend as much time alone in the wilderness as I do, you either learn to cook or you eat a lot of cold beans from a can." "Well, I'm grateful for your mother's foresight," Josephine said, smiling. "And speaking of mothers, tell me more about your family." "You've mentioned your mother and sister, but not much else." Preston's expression closed slightly, but after a moment he relented. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Ohio. Father was a carpenter, mother kept house and took in sewing when money was tight. Had an older brother who died at Gettysburg and a younger sister who married a banker in St. Louis. Haven't seen her since '67. "Why not?" Josephine asked gently. Preston stared into his bowl. "Her husband doesn't approve of me, thinks I'm uncivilized living out here like this. He offered me a job at his bank after the war, but I couldn't stomach the thought of being cooped up inside all day, wearing a suit and counting other people's money." He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Some men aren't built for that kind of life." Josephine nodded, understanding more than he knew. "And some women aren't built for the kind of life society expects of them, either." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. "Is that why you came west, to escape expectations?" It was Josephine's turn to look away. "Partly. My marriage ended poorly. A divorced woman has few options in Philadelphia society, even one from a respectable family." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "When my uncle's letter arrived, offering me his property if I wanted it, it seemed like providence, a chance to be judged on my own merits rather than my past mistakes." Preston was silent for a moment, absorbing this revelation. "You said you were a widow," he said finally, no accusation in his tone, merely observation. Josephine flushed. "I've found people are more sympathetic to a widow than a divorced woman. It's a harmless deception." "Not to me, it isn't," Preston said, surprising her. "You don't need to pretend to be someone you're not, Josephine, not in my house." The simple acceptance in his words brought unexpected tears to Josephine's eyes. She blinked them back hastily. "Thank you, it's refreshing to be honest." Preston's expression softened. "Your past is your business. But for what it's worth, most folks out here are too busy with their own troubles to worry much about yours." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Josephine found herself watching Preston with new eyes. There was a depth to him that belied his rough exterior, and intelligence and sensitivity that made her increasingly curious about the man behind the stoic facade. As the days passed, and Josephine's strength returned, she grew restless, confined to the house. Preston noticed her increasing frustration, and one morning surprised her by appearing with a wheelchair borrowed from Dr. Morgan. "Thought you might like to see a bit of Durango," he said, wheeling the contraption into the parlor. "If you're feeling up to it." Josephine's face lit up with genuine delight. "I'd love that. Let me get my shawl." The excursion into town proved to be a revelation. Preston wheeled her slowly down Durango's main street, stopping to introduce her to shopkeepers and townspeople along the way. To Josephine's surprise, everyone greeted her warmly, many offering sympathy for her accident and loss of possessions. "Word travels fast in a small town," Preston explained as they left the general store, where the proprietor had insisted on giving Josephine a new journal and pencil at no charge. "By now, everyone knows you're the lady who survived being buried in an avalanche." They stopped at the county clerk's office, where Preston introduced Josephine to Walter Simmons, a bespectacled man with a perpetually worried expression. "Miss Hayes has had some misfortune with her documentation," Preston explained. "She was coming to claim her uncle's property when the Avalanche took everything she had, including the deed." Mr. Simmons frowned sympathetically. "That is unfortunate. What was your uncle's name, Miss Hayes?" "Thomas Blackburn," Josephine replied. "He had a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town, I believe. He passed away in October of last year." Recognition dawned on Mr. Simmons's face. "Ah, yes, the Blackburn place. I remember the probate notice. The lawyer was Harrington from Denver, if I recall correctly." "That's right," Josephine confirmed, hope rising in her chest. Mr. Simmons shuffled through some papers on his desk. "Well, I don't have the records here showing who inherited the property, but I can certainly wire Mr. Harrington to confirm your claim. It will take a few days to get a response, though." "Thank you," Josephine said gratefully. "I'd appreciate that very much." As they left the clerk's office, Josephine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "That's one worry addressed, at least," she said to Preston. "Now I just need to figure out how to manage a ranch with no money, no supplies, and a broken leg." Preston's lips twitched into a smile. "One problem at a time, Miss Hayes. Let's get your property secured first. Then we'll worry about the rest." Their next stop was the bank, where Preston introduced Josephine to the manager, a portly man named Franklin Biggs. After hearing her story, Mr. Biggs agreed to extend a small loan once her property claim was verified, enough to purchase basic necessities and hire help for the ranch. "Preston's word carries weight in this town," Mr. Biggs explained to Josephine's surprised expression. "If he vouches for you, that's good enough for me." By the time they returned to Preston's house, Josephine was exhausted but exhilarated. In a single afternoon, she'd made more progress toward securing her future than she would have thought possible. "Thank you," she said as Preston helped her from the wheelchair to the sofa, "for everything today. I'm beginning to think you might be my guardian angel, Mr. Hawkins." Preston looked embarrassed by her gratitude. "Just being neighborly. Besides, once you're settled at your ranch, I'll have my spare room back." Despite his gruff response, Josephine caught the hint of a smile that suggested he wasn't entirely eager to see her go. The realization gave her a warm feeling that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. 4 days later, a telegram arrived from Denver confirming Josephine's identity and her inheritance of the Blackburn property. Mr. Simmons personally delivered the news, along with a copy of the deed recorded in the county records. "The original will be reissued by Mr. Harrington's office and sent directly to you," he explained. "In the meantime, this copy is legally sufficient to establish your ownership. Congratulations, Miss Hayes. You're now officially a property owner in La Plata County." Josephine couldn't contain her delight, impulsively hugging the startled clerk. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. You've been so helpful." After the clerk departed, Josephine turned to Preston, who had been quietly observing from the doorway. "I can scarcely believe it. After everything that's happened, to finally have something solid under my feet again." "You should celebrate," Preston said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I know a place that serves the best apple pie in 3 counties. What do you say? Dinner at the hotel restaurant tonight. My treat." Josephine hesitated, aware that such an invitation carried different connotations in a small town like Durango. "Are you sure that's wise? People might talk." Preston shrugged. "People always talk, but if it makes you more comfortable, we can invite Mrs. Fitzgerald to join us." Josephine considered for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I'd like to go, just the 2 of us. After all you've done for me, the least I can do is enjoy a meal with you without a chaperone hovering over us like we're misbehaving children." Preston's smile widened. "I'll reserve a table for 7 then." That evening, Josephine took extra care with her appearance, grateful for the dresses Mrs. Fitzgerald had provided. She chose a deep blue one that brought out the color of her eyes and arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style. When she emerged from her room, she was gratified to see Preston's momentary look of appreciation before he schooled his features into their usual reserve. He had made an effort too, she noticed. His usual trail clothes had been replaced by a clean shirt, waistcoat, and jacket that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his beard. "You look very handsome, Mr. Hawkins," Josephine said, enjoying the flush that spread across his cheekbones. "And you look beautiful, Miss Hayes," he replied with formal courtesy, though his eyes conveyed more than his words. The Durango Hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in town, not elaborate by Eastern standards, but impressive for a frontier community. White tablecloths, silver cutlery, and oil lamps creating pools of golden light gave the room an atmosphere of simple elegance. Heads turned as Preston wheeled Josephine to a table near the window, and Josephine was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered comments. "Ignore them," Preston advised quietly as he helped her into her chair. "Half the men in this room wish they were in my place right now." The unexpected compliment brought a blush to Josephine's cheeks. "I think you overestimate my appeal, sir. More likely they're wondering what business a proper Eastern lady has dining alone with the local mountain man." Preston's eyes glinted with amusement. "Is that how you see me?" "As a mountain man. At first, perhaps," Josephine admitted. "But now I see you're much more complex than that. A scholar who prefers the wilderness to the classroom. A soldier who chose peace and solitude after seeing too much war. A man who rescues strangers from avalanches and opens his home to them without question." Preston looked simultaneously pleased and uncomfortable with her assessment. "You give me too much credit," he said, reaching for the menu. "I'm just a man who's learned to live by his own rules." The meal that followed was the most enjoyable Josephine had experienced in years. The food was excellent, but it was the conversation that truly nourished her. Without the constraints of propriety that had governed their interactions in his home, they spoke more freely, discovering shared interests in literature and history, debating politics with respectful disagreement, and exchanging stories of their respective childhoods. Preston, Josephine discovered, had a dry wit that emerged when he was relaxed, and a laugh that transformed his usually serious face into something approaching boyish charm. She found herself deliberately trying to elicit that laugh, savoring each success as a personal triumph. For his part, Preston seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and experiences, listening attentively and asking thoughtful questions. It was a novel experience for Josephine, whose former husband had dismissed her thoughts as trivial, and whose society acquaintances had valued her only for her family connections and ability to entertain. As they lingered over coffee and the promised apple pie, Josephine realized with a start that she was genuinely happy, perhaps for the first time since her childhood. The revelation was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had come west to start a new life, not to develop feelings for the first man who showed her kindness. "Penny for your thoughts," Preston said, noticing her sudden silence. Josephine smiled, pushing aside her complicated emotions. "I was just thinking how strange life can be. A month ago I was on a train heading west, convinced my future lay in independence and self-sufficiency. Now here I am, more dependent on the kindness of others than I've ever been." Preston considered this. "Independence is overrated," he said finally. "Out here, no one truly survives alone. We all need each other one way or another, even me with all my solitary ways. Is that why you keep a house in town? To remind yourself you're not alone? Josephine asked, genuinely curious. Preston nodded slowly. Partly. And partly because sometimes, after weeks in the mountains with nothing but my own thoughts for company, I need to remember what it's like to be around people. He paused, then added more quietly, though I'm selective about which people. The implication that she was among those select few warmed Josephine more than the coffee in her cup. Well, I'm grateful to be included in that category, Mr. Hawkins. Your company has been the silver lining in what could have been an unmitigated disaster. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the connection that had formed, unexpected but undeniable. For a breathless moment, Josephine thought Preston might say something more, might acknowledge what she was beginning to feel. But then he glanced away, signaling for the check, and the moment passed. The next day brought new developments. Dr. Morgan, examining Josephine's leg, declared it was healing well enough that she could begin to put minimal weight on it with the aid of crutches. Short distances only, he warned as he showed her how to use them. And always with someone nearby in case you lose your balance, but it's important to start moving again if you want to regain full strength. Josephine practiced walking the length of Preston's parlor, delighting in the small freedom even as her arms protested the unfamiliar exercise. Preston watched from the doorway, his expression a mix of approval and concern. I should ride out to your ranch today, he said after Dr. Morgan departed. See what condition it's in, make a list of what you'll need when you're ready to move in. Josephine paused in her halting progress across the room. Would you? That would be tremendously helpful, Preston nodded. I'll be gone most of the day. Mrs. Fitzgerald will check in on you around noon. Will you be all right on your own otherwise? Of course, Josephine assured him, touched by his concern. These crutches have already expanded my world considerably. I can at least make myself a cup of tea now without having to ask for help. Preston smiled at her enthusiasm. Just don't overdo it. Dr. Morgan said short distances, not expeditions. After he left, Josephine busied herself with making lists of supplies she would need for the ranch, based on her admittedly limited knowledge of frontier living. By midday, she had filled several pages of her new journal and was beginning to realize how woefully unprepared she was for the challenge ahead. Mrs. Fitzgerald arrived with lunch and fresh gossip, the latter delivered with obvious relish. Half the town's talking about you and Preston dining at the hotel last night, the older woman reported as she set out sandwiches. Mabel Jenkins swears he was looking at you like a man dying of thirst looks at water. Josephine felt her cheeks warm. Mrs. Fitzgerald, really? Mr. Hawkins was simply being kind to a friend in need. Mrs. Fitzgerald snorted. Friend, indeed. I've known Preston Hawkins for 7 years, and I've never seen him take any woman to dinner at the hotel, let alone look at one the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Josephine's heart skipped at this revelation, but she tried to maintain her composure. Even if that were true, which I doubt, I'm hardly in a position to encourage such attention. I've only just secured my property, and I have a ranch to establish. Romance is the last thing on my mind. Mrs. Fitzgerald responded, clearly unconvinced. Just remember, opportunities for happiness don't come along every day, especially out here. Sometimes you have to grab them when they appear, practical considerations be damned. The older woman's blunt advice stayed with Josephine throughout the afternoon, as she continued working on her lists and practicing with her crutches. By the time Preston returned at dusk, she had almost convinced herself that Mrs. Fitzgerald was imagining things until she saw his face light up when he entered the parlor and found her waiting. "How was the ranch?" she asked, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach. Preston removed his hat and coat before answering. "Better than I expected. The house is small but solid, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room. Roof needs some patching and the well pump needs fixing, but nothing major. There's a good barn, a chicken coop, and about 30 acres of decent grazing land." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Your uncle even planted some flowers around the porch. They're overgrown now, but they'll come back in spring." Josephine could picture it clearly from his description, not grand, but a real home, a place where she could build a life on her own terms. "It sounds perfect," she said softly. "When can I see it?" "Soon as you're steady enough on those crutches for a wagon ride," Preston promised. "Maybe next week if Dr. Morgan agrees." Over dinner, Preston shared more details about the ranch, the condition of the fencing, the small orchard of apple trees behind the house, the stream that ran along the eastern boundary. Josephine listened eagerly, her imagination filling in the gaps in his practical assessment. "What about livestock?" she asked. "Did my uncle leave any animals?" Preston shook his head. "Neighbors took them after he passed, but they'll sell them back to you. There's a family named Ortiz on the next property, good people. They've been keeping an eye on the place, making sure no squatters moved in. Mrs. Ortiz said to tell you she'd be happy to help you settle in when you're ready." The generosity of these strangers touched Josephine deeply. "I've been so focused on what I lost in that avalanche that I didn't stop to appreciate what I've found here, people willing to help a newcomer for no reason other than kindness. That's how it works out here," Preston said simply. "Today you help your neighbor, tomorrow they help you. No one survives alone." It was the second time he'd expressed that sentiment, and Josephine found herself wondering about the experiences that had taught him that lesson. For a man who spent so much time in solitude, Preston seemed to understand the value of community more deeply than many who lived in its midst. The week that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Each day, Josephine grew stronger and more adept with her crutches. Preston, when not out on scouting jobs, helped her practice walking further distances, his hand steady at her elbow when she faltered. They spent evenings by the fire, reading or talking, discovering more points of connection with each conversation. On Sunday, Preston surprised her by suggesting they attend services at the small church on Main Street. "You want to go to church?" Josephine asked, unable to hide her surprise. Somehow she hadn't pictured Preston as a religious man. "I thought you might like to," he clarified. "It's a good way to meet more of the community. The pastor's wife runs the Ladies' Aid Society. They might be able to help you with household items for the ranch." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Josephine agreed, and that morning found them seated in a pew near the back of the simple wooden church. As Preston had predicted, they were warmly welcomed, and after the service, Josephine found herself surrounded by curious but friendly women eager to offer assistance to the Avalanche survivor. By the end of the social hour, she had promises of quilts, preserved food, kitchen implements, and even a kitten from a recent litter to help control mice at the ranch. More importantly, she had begun to form connections that might develop into friendships, something she hadn't realized how desperately she needed. Walking back to Preston's house, Josephine felt a newfound optimism about her future in Durango. "Thank you for suggesting church," she said, navigating carefully with her crutches over the uneven ground. "You were right about the community aspect." Preston, walking slowly beside her, nodded. "Frontier towns survive on cooperation. Durango's young, but it's already developing the kind of bonds that will see it through hard times." "Is that why you settled here? For the sense of community?" Josephine asked. Preston considered the question. "Partly. and partly because the mountain spoke to me in a way no place ever had before. He glanced at her, a hint of self-consciousness in his expression. That sounds fanciful, I know. Not at all, Josephine assured him. I felt something similar when the train crossed into Colorado territory. There's a vastness here that makes me feel both small and significant at the same time. As if I matter precisely because I'm part of something so much larger than myself. Preston's eyes warmed with understanding. Exactly that. The moment of connection lingered between them as they continued their slow progress, and Josephine found herself wishing she could reach out and take his hand. But propriety and her own uncertainty held her back. Preston had been unfailingly kind and supportive, but he had never explicitly expressed romantic interest. Perhaps Mrs. Fitzgerald had been wrong after all, and his actions stemmed purely from generosity of spirit rather than any deeper feelings. 2 days later, Dr. Morgan pronounced Josephine fit enough for a short excursion to see her ranch. Preston arranged to borrow a wagon with good springs and padded the seat with extra blankets to minimize jolting. The mid-March day dawned clear and relatively mild, perfect for the 5-mile journey. Josephine could barely contain her excitement as they set out, scanning the landscape eagerly as they left the town behind and followed the winding road through rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines. Preston pointed out landmarks along the way: the creek that ran high during spring melt, the rocky outcropping that marked the boundary of the county, the distant peaks of the mountains where he had found her. "There it is," he said finally, gesturing toward a small valley ahead where a log cabin stood nestled against a backdrop of trees. "Blackburn Ranch, your ranch now." Josephine leaned forward, taking in the sight of her inheritance. It was more modest than she had imagined: a simple log structure with a stone chimney, a weathered barn, and various outbuildings scattered around a yard where chickens might once have scratched. But as they drew closer, she could see the elements that made it a home: the covered porch with its railing, the cleared area where a garden had been planted, the apple trees Preston had mentioned just beginning to bud with the promise of spring. "It's perfect," she breathed, and meant it. Preston smiled at her enthusiasm. "Let's get you inside so you can see the rest." With his help, Josephine managed the steps to the porch and entered what would be her new home. The interior was dusty and cold, but structurally sound. Preston had described it accurately: a main room with a large fireplace, a small kitchen with a cast iron stove, and 2 bedrooms off a short hallway. The furnishings were sparse but serviceable: a table and chairs, a sofa covered with a faded quilt, a bookshelf with a few volumes. "My uncle lived here alone?" Josephine asked, trailing her fingers along the mantel where a few photographs in tarnished frames stood. Preston nodded. "For about 10 years, from what folks say. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly. Raised a few cattle, grew vegetables, did some trapping in winter." Josephine picked up one of the photographs: a stern-faced man standing beside a younger version of herself. "I barely knew him. He was my father's brother, but they had a falling out before I was born. He wrote to me only once last autumn to say he was leaving me his property. I never got to thank him." Preston moved to stand beside her, looking at the photograph. Maybe this was his way of mending fences, even if he couldn't do it in person. "Perhaps," Josephine agreed, touched by the thought. She set the photograph down and continued her exploration, imagining how the place would look with a fire in the hearth, curtains at the windows, and her own modest possessions arranged to make it home. In the 2nd bedroom, she found a hope chest at the foot of the narrow bed. Opening it curiously, she discovered linens, quilts, and a woman's shawl wrapped carefully in tissue paper. "I wonder who these belong to," she mused. "Your uncle was married once long ago," Preston said from the doorway. "His wife died in childbirth, along with the baby. That's what drove him west from what I've heard." Josephine's heart ached for the uncle she'd never really known, understanding now, perhaps, why he'd left his property to her, a niece who had also experienced loss, though of a different kind. "I'll honor his legacy," she said softly. "Make this place thrive again." Preston's expression was warm with admiration. "I believe you will." They spent another hour at the ranch, with Preston showing Josephine the well, the barn, and the boundaries of the property. By the time they headed back to town, Josephine's mind was racing with plans and possibilities. "I'll need help," she acknowledged as they drove. "Someone to fix the roof and the well pump, to plow the garden and repair the fences, and I know nothing about raising cattle or chickens." "The Ortiz family can help with a lot of that," Preston assured her. "And I know a couple of reliable ranch hands looking for work. As for the rest, you'll learn as you go. Everyone does." Josephine glanced at him, a question she'd been considering for days finally finding voice. "And you, will you help me too?" Preston kept his eyes on the road, his profile giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Of course. I promised I'd see you settled, and I mean to keep that promise." It wasn't quite the answer Josephine had hoped for. There was a finality to it that suggested an end point to their association rather than a continuation. But she nodded, accepting what he offered. "I appreciate that." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparations. With the bank loan secured, Josephine purchased supplies, hired workers to begin repairs on the ranch, and arranged to buy back the livestock the neighbors had taken in after her uncle's death. Preston accompanied her on these errands, offering advice and introductions, but maintaining a careful distance that left Josephine increasingly confused and frustrated. There were moments when she caught him looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race, moments when their hands brushed and neither pulled away immediately. Moments of shared laughter or understanding that seemed to transcend mere friendship. But always, Preston would retreat behind his reserve, avoiding any situation that might lead to a more personal conversation. Mrs. Fitzgerald, observing this dance of approach and retreat, finally took matters into her own hands. Arriving one afternoon when Preston was out, she settled herself in the parlor with a determined expression. "That man is driving me to distraction with his stubbornness," she announced without preamble. "And you're not much better, my dear, waiting for him to make the first move when it's clear as day he's never going to do it." Josephine blinked at this direct assault. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, I'm not sure what you're implying." "Oh, don't play coy with me, young lady," the older woman interrupted. "Anyone with eyes can see you two are sweet on each other, but Preston's got it in his head that you're too fine a lady for the likes of him, and he'd rather die alone than risk rejection." Josephine stared at her, momentarily speechless. "He thinks I'm too good for him. That's absurd." Mrs. Fitzgerald snorted. "Of course it is. But men can be remarkably dense about these things, especially men who have convinced themselves they're better off alone." She leaned forward, her expression softening. "Look, dear, I've known Preston since he came to Durango. He's a good man, the best, but he's been hurt before. Not by a woman, mind you, but by life. By the war, by losing his brother, by his sister choosing her husband's prejudices over her own blood. He's built walls to protect himself, and it'll take someone special to bring them down." Josephine absorbed this information slowly. "You think I could be that someone?" "I know you could," Mrs. Fitzgerald said firmly, "but only if you're brave enough to make the first move. Preston will never presume to think you might want a future with a rough mountain man, no matter how educated or kind he might be. You're an Eastern lady with options. In his mind, You'll eventually want to return to civilization." "But I don't," Josephine said, the realization crystallizing as she spoke. "I came west to build a new life, to find a place where I could be myself without judgment. And since the moment Preston pulled me from that avalanche, I felt more at home than I ever did in Philadelphia, Mrs. Fitzgerald smiled with satisfaction. "Then perhaps you should tell him that, before you move to your ranch, and he convinces himself his duty to you is done." The older woman's words echoed in Josephine's mind for the rest of the day. When Preston returned that evening, she watched him with new understanding, seeing the careful way he maintained distance even as his eyes followed her movements across the room. That night, unable to sleep, Josephine made a decision. Pride and propriety had governed her life long enough. If she wanted a chance at happiness with Preston, she would have to be the one to reach for it. Her opportunity came the next morning. Preston had promised to take her to the ranch to oversee the repairs, and they set out early, the spring sunshine warming the air as they traveled the now familiar road. "The roof's been patched, and the well pump is working again," Preston reported as they drove. "The Ortiz boy fixed the chicken coop, and the fences around the main pasture are repaired. You should be able to move in by the end of the week if you're feeling up to it." Josephine nodded, gathering her courage. "And what about you, Preston? What will you do once I'm settled at the ranch?" He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins. "I've got a scouting job lined up with a survey team heading into the mountains. I'll be gone for a few weeks, maybe a month." "I see," Josephine said quietly. "And after that," Preston shrugged. "There's always work for a man who knows the mountains. I'll be around if you need help with anything at the ranch." "And if I need help with something else?" Josephine asked, her heart pounding. "If I need companionship," Preston's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't look at her. "The Ortiz family will be good neighbors, and you've made friends in town. The pastor's wife mentioned inviting you to join the quilting circle." Josephine took a deep breath, frustrated by his deliberate misunderstanding. "That's not what I meant, and I think you know it." The wagon rounded a bend in the road, and Preston finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes guarded. "What are you saying, Josephine?" "I'm saying that I care for you," she said simply. "More than as a friend or benefactor. I'm saying that the thought of you riding away for weeks at a time makes my heart ache. I'm saying that when I imagine my future at the ranch, you're part of that vision." Preston stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and something that might have been hope. "You can't mean that," he said finally. "You're an educated woman from a good family. You could have any man you wanted." "I want you," Josephine replied, reaching out to touch his hand on the reins. "The man who dug for hours to save a stranger's life. The man who opened his home to me when I had nothing. The man who treats everyone with respect regardless of their station or color. The man who makes me laugh and challenges my mind and truly sees me for who I am." She paused, searching his face. "Unless I've completely misread the situation and you don't feel the same way." Preston halted the wagon abruptly, turning to face her fully. "Misread?" he echoed, his voice rough with emotion. "Josephine, from the moment I pulled you out of that snow, I've been fighting how I feel about you. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, brave and kind and determined. But I didn't want to take advantage of your situation, to make you feel obligated because I helped you." "Obligated?" Josephine shook her head, a small smile forming. "Preston Hawkins, if I felt obligated to marry every man who's ever helped me, I'd be the most polygamous woman in Colorado territory. I'm not offering my heart out of gratitude. I'm offering it because somewhere between nearly dying in an avalanche and planning my new life, I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that couldn't be taken back or misinterpreted. For a long moment, Preston said nothing, and Josephine felt a flicker of doubt. Had she been too forward? Had Mrs. Fitzgerald been wrong about his feelings? Then Preston released the reins and reached for her, his hands cradling her face with infinite gentleness. "I love you too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "God help me. I've tried not to, but I do." And then he was kissing her, his lips warm and certain against hers, and Josephine was kissing him back, her hands gripping the lapels of his coat as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. It was a kiss of discovery and confirmation, of questions answered and promises made, and when they finally parted, Josephine felt dizzy with happiness. "Well," she said, trying to catch her breath, "that settles that, I suppose." Preston laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in a way she'd never heard before. "Not quite. There's still the matter of what happens next." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "I believe traditional custom suggests courtship, followed by marriage if both parties remain amenable. And are you amenable to marrying a mountain man who spends half his time in the wilderness?" Preston asked, suddenly serious again. Josephine considered this. "I am, with one condition." "Name it," Preston said immediately. "That when you're not in the wilderness, you're with me at the ranch. That we make a home together there." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't come west to be alone, Preston. I came to find a place where I could belong, truly belong. And I believe that place is with you." Preston's eyes shone with an emotion Josephine had never seen there before, pure, unguarded joy. "I can think of nothing I want more," he said, and sealed the promise with another kiss. They were married 2 weeks later in Durango's small church, with half the town in attendance. Josephine wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Denver, and leaned on a decorative cane rather than crutches as she walked down the aisle. Preston, looking both nervous and proud in a new suit, waited for her at the altar with Dr. Morgan standing as his best man. Mrs. Fitzgerald, serving as Josephine's matron of honor, wept unashamedly throughout the ceremony and later claimed full credit for the match. "If I hadn't given that girl a push, they'd still be dancing around each other," she told anyone who would listen at the reception held at the hotel. After a brief honeymoon at a hot springs resort in Ouray, the newlyweds returned to the Blackburn Ranch, now the Hawkins Ranch, to begin their life together. The property had been transformed in their absence by the combined efforts of friends and neighbors. The house gleamed with fresh paint. The garden had been planted with spring vegetables, and a handmade sign bearing their names hung beside the front door. Inside, Josephine's meager possessions had been supplemented by wedding gifts: quilts and curtains, cookware and dishes, books and ornaments that turned the simple cabin into a home. But the best gift, as far as Josephine was concerned, was the large desk installed in the main room, Preston's wedding present to her. "For your writing," he explained when she looked at him questioningly. "You mentioned once that you used to write stories before your marriage. I thought perhaps you'd like to try again." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "You remembered that. I only mentioned it once in passing." Preston smiled, drawing her into his arms. "I remember everything you tell me, Mrs. Hawkins. Especially the things that make your eyes light up when you speak of them." That first year on the ranch brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Josephine's leg healed completely, though she walked with a slight limp in cold weather. She learned to cook on a wood stove, to tend chickens, to plant and harvest a kitchen garden. Preston built up the cattle herd gradually, teaching Josephine the basics of ranching while continuing his scouting work, though he limited his absences to no more than a week at a time. They weathered their first crisis that autumn, when an early blizzard threatened the herd. Preston and the Ortiz men worked tirelessly to bring the cattle down from the high pastures, while Josephine kept fires burning and soup simmering, ready to warm half-frozen cowboys as they staggered in from the storm. They lost only 3 head, a minor miracle, according to their neighbors. That night, exhausted but triumphant, Preston held Josephine close in their bed and whispered, "You were magnificent today. Not many women would have kept their composure through that chaos." Josephine smiled against his chest. Not many women have survived being buried in an avalanche either. After that, a blizzard seems manageable. As winter settled over the ranch, they fell into comfortable routines. During the short days, Preston repaired equipment in the barn while Josephine wrote at her desk, occasionally reading passages aloud for his opinion. In the evenings, they sat before the fire, reading or talking or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. It was during one such evening, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, that Josephine set aside her book and took Preston's hand. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes shining with happiness. "Something wonderful." Preston looked up, curious. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Josephine said, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "In late spring, the doctor says." Preston's expression transformed from surprise to wonder to pure joy in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby? You're sure?" Josephine nodded, laughing at his amazement. "Quite sure. Dr. Morgan confirmed it yesterday when I was in town." "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" Preston asked, pulling her into his lap. "Because I wanted the moment to be perfect," Josephine explained, stroking his bearded cheek. "Just the 2 of us by our own fireside with no distractions." Preston kissed her then, pouring all his happiness and love into the gesture. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed softly. "A home, a wife, a child on the way. After the war, I didn't think I deserved such happiness." "You deserve every happiness," Josephine assured him fiercely, "and so much more." Their son, Thomas Preston Hawkins, was born on a perfect May morning in 1878, with Dr. and Mrs. Morgan attending the birth and Mrs. Fitzgerald pacing anxiously on the porch. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin, and from his first lusty cry, it was clear he had inherited both of their strong wills. Preston, holding his son for the first time, looked at Josephine with such profound love and gratitude that words seemed superfluous. But he found them anyway, bending to kiss her damp forehead. "Thank you for giving me a family," he whispered, "for making me whole again." Josephine smiled tiredly, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "We made each other whole," she corrected gently. "From the moment you dug me out of that avalanche, we were headed toward this, toward healing, toward home, toward each other." And as Preston cradled their newborn son and gazed at his exhausted but radiant wife, he knew she was right. The path that had led them here through war and wilderness, through loss and loneliness, through an avalanche that should have claimed Josephine's life, but instead had given them both a second chance, had been leading to this moment all along. Outside their window, the apple trees his wife had so admired when she first saw the ranch were in full bloom, promising a bountiful harvest to come. Like those trees, their love had taken root in unlikely soil, had weathered storms and seasons, and now bore fruit more precious than either could have imagined. "I love you," Preston said simply, the words encompassing all he felt but couldn't express his gratitude for her presence in his life, his amazement at the family they had created, his certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "And I love you," Josephine replied, her eyes already drooping with exhaustion. "Always." As she drifted into sleep, Preston settled into the chair beside the bed, their son nestled securely in his arms, Tomorrow there would be visitors and congratulations, chores and responsibilities. But for now, in this perfect moment, there was only the three of them, a family forged by circumstance, bound by choice, and sustained by a love as vast and enduring as the mountains that had brought them together. In the years that followed, the Hawkins family thrived. Their ranch grew prosperous under their joint stewardship, with Preston's practical knowledge of the land complementing Josephine's keen business sense. They added a daughter, Elizabeth Leaner, to their family in 1880, and another son, James Walter, in 1883. Preston continued his scouting work, but more selectively, choosing jobs that kept him closer to home and his growing family. Josephine's writing flourished. Her stories of frontier life, published under a pseudonym in Eastern magazines, brought both income and satisfaction. And each winter, as snow blanketed the mountains and the anniversary of their fateful meeting approached, they would stand together on their porch, looking toward the distant peaks where an avalanche had buried a wagon and changed the course of two lives forever. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" Josephine would ask, leaning into her husband's embrace. "If I'd left Denver a day earlier or later, if you'd taken a different trail home." And Preston would tighten his arms around her, grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought this remarkable woman into his life. "I don't believe it was chance," he would reply. "Some things are meant to be, avalanche or no avalanche." Josephine would smile at that, at her pragmatic husband's unexpected touch of romanticism. "Well, I'm glad it was you who found me, regardless of whether it was fate or fortune." "So am I, my love," Preston would always answer. "So am I."